Elizabeth Whittaker stepped off the train with a prayer on her lips and hope in her heart, only to watch her future disappear like smoke in the wild prairie wind as the man who was supposed to meet her was nowhere to be found. The small station at Silver Creek, Colorado Territory, 1876, held nothing but dust, tumbleweeds, and a few indifferent strangers who barely glanced her way. The westbound train whistled sharply before chugging away, leaving her alone on the wooden platform with her trunk and carpet bag. Elizabeth's legs trembled beneath her dark blue traveling dress as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met. A Mr. Harold Blackwell, who had placed an advertisement for a bride in the Eastern paper. His letters had been warm and promising, describing a comfortable ranch house and a respectable business in town, but Harold Blackwell was not here. "Last stop, Silver Creek," the conductor had called just 15 minutes earlier. "All passengers for Silver Creek disembark." Elizabeth had been the only one to step down. She had expected to be greeted, to be welcomed, to begin her new life. Instead, the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she stood abandoned at the lonely outpost. "Excuse me," she called to the station master, a grizzled older man who was preparing to lock up the small wooden building that served as ticket office and telegraph station. "I'm expecting to be met by Mr. Harold Blackwell. Do you know him?" The station master squinted at her. "Blackwell? Don't know no Blackwell round these parts, miss." Elizabeth's heart sank. But he wrote that he owned property here, a ranch outside of town and a business establishment. "Been station master here 8 years, the man said, shaking his head. "Never heard that name before." "Perhaps he's simply delayed," Elizabeth said, more to herself than to the man. She glanced down the dusty road leading to town, hoping to see a buggy approaching. There was nothing but the empty road stretching toward the small cluster of buildings that made up Silver Creek. The station master shrugged. "Might be. Can't say. I'm closing up now. Town's that way, about half a mile." He pointed, then turned the key in the lock. "Could I wait inside, please?" Elizabeth asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Just until someone comes?" "Nobody's coming tonight, miss. Last train's gone through." "I got a home to get to." The station master tipped his hat and ambled away, leaving Elizabeth alone as the shadows lengthened across the platform. She sat on her trunk, fighting back tears. 22 years old, and she had gambled everything on this journey west. Her parents had died of influenza 2 winters ago, leaving her with no family and few prospects in Boston. The advertisement had seemed like providence. Successful businessman seeks educated Christian lady of good character to share comfortable home in growing Colorado town. Must be willing to leave Eastern comforts for frontier life. Now she was stranded. The evening growing cooler by the minute, with nowhere to go and night approaching. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A rider approached from the direction opposite the town, coming from what appeared to be open rangeland. As he drew closer, Elizabeth could make out a tall man on a chestnut horse. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see broad shoulders and a straight back. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life on horseback. The rider slowed as he neared the station, clearly surprised to see someone waiting there. He pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "Evening, madam," he called, tipping his hat. "Train's gone for the day." "Yes, I know," Elizabeth replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was meant to be met, but it seems there's been some confusion." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his impressive height. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. He approached cautiously, as if afraid of frightening her. "Preston James," he introduced himself, stopping a few paces away. "My ranch is about 5 miles west of here. You seem to be in a difficult spot, miss." "Whittaker, Elizabeth Whittaker," she replied, automatically extending her hand as she'd been taught in Boston society, then feeling foolish as the gesture seemed oddly formal in this dusty, abandoned place. To her surprise, the cowboy took her gloved hand gently in his own calloused one. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Whittaker." He released her hand and glanced at her trunk and carpet bag. "Were you expecting family to meet you?" Elizabeth hesitated, embarrassment washing over her. How could she explain that she had traveled all this way to marry a stranger who appeared not to exist? "Not family," she said finally. I was to meet Mr. Harold Blackwell. I'm his, that is, I was to be his bride." The words tumbled out, and once started she couldn't seem to stop them. "We've corresponded for months. He sent money for my train ticket, but the station master says he's never heard of him." Preston James's expression darkened. "Blackwell, you say?" Elizabeth nodded, a spark of hope igniting. "You know him?" "No, madam, and that's the problem. I know most everyone within 50 miles of Silver Creek. There's no Harold Blackwell hereabouts." He paused, removing his hat and running a hand through thick dark hair. "I hate to say it, Miss Whittaker, but it sounds like you might have been taken advantage of." The hope died as quickly as it had come. "Taken advantage of?" she repeated, though in her heart she was beginning to understand. "It happens," Preston said gently. "Scoundrels place advertisements, correspond with Eastern ladies, take their money for train tickets, and then, well, there's no ranch, no business, no husband waiting." "But why would anyone do such a thing?" Elizabeth whispered, though she knew the answer. The money her parents had left her was gone, now spent on the journey and the trousseau she had so carefully packed in her trunk. "Because they can," Preston said, his voice hardening, "and because no one stops them." He looked at the darkening sky, then back at Elizabeth. "Miss Whittaker, night's coming on. Silver Creek has a small hotel, but it's not the sort of place a lady should stay alone. My sister runs a respectable boarding house in town. I'd be happy to take you there." Elizabeth looked at this stranger, this tall, handsome cowboy with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She had no reason to trust him, and yet she had no choice. The alternative was to spend the night alone at the station. "That's very kind of you, Mr. James," she said, summoning what dignity she could. "I would be grateful for your assistance." Preston nodded. "Let me get your trunk." He approached and lifted the heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing, carrying it to his horse. With practiced efficiency, he secured it behind his saddle. "You'll have to ride with me," he said, returning for her carpet bag. "It's not far to town." Elizabeth stared at the large horse. In Boston, she had occasionally ridden in the park, but always side saddle, always properly accompanied. The idea of sitting on this enormous animal with a strange man made her hesitate. Preston seemed to sense her discomfort. "I promise you'll be safe, Miss Whittaker. I was raised by a good mother who'd tan my hide from here to Sunday if I ever behaved improperly toward a lady." Despite everything, Elizabeth found herself smiling. "I believe you, Mr. James. It's just that I've never ridden like this before." "Well, there's a first time for everything in the West," he said, returning her smile. He held out his hand. "May I?" Elizabeth took a deep breath and placed her hand in his. Preston helped her to the horse, then mounted behind her with a smooth motion that spoke of years in the saddle. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a secure circle without actually touching her. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he instructed, and Elizabeth gripped the leather protrusion with both hands as the horse began to move. The sun was setting over the mountains as they rode toward Silver Creek, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Elizabeth was acutely aware of the man behind her, his clean scent of leather, horses, and something like pine, the solid warmth of him, the careful way he kept a respectful distance despite their close proximity. "May I ask why you're traveling alone, Miss Whittaker?" Preston asked as they rode. Elizabeth explained about her parents, the lack of prospects in Boston, the seemingly providential advertisement. "I suppose I was foolish," she concluded. "Not foolish," Preston said. "Brave. It takes courage to leave everything you know and journey into the unknown. The West was built by people with that kind of courage." His words warmed her, offering a small comfort in what had become the most humiliating day of her life. As they approached the town, Elizabeth could see a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various businesses. At the far end stood a 2-story white house with a sign out front, "Mrs. Miller's Boarding House." "That's my sister's place," Preston explained. She was widowed 2 years ago. Running the boarding house keeps her busy. He helped Elizabeth dismount when they reached the neat picket fence surrounding the house. Her legs felt wobbly after the ride, and she stumbled slightly. Preston's strong hand steadied her, then quickly released her once she found her balance. "Pamela!" he called as he lifted Elizabeth's trunk from the horse. "Got a visitor for you." The door opened, revealing a pretty woman in her late 20s with the same striking blue eyes as Preston. Her welcoming smile faltered slightly when she saw Elizabeth, then brightened again. "Well, hello there," she said, coming down the steps. "I'm Pamela Miller, Preston's sister." "Elizabeth Whittaker," Elizabeth replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious in her wrinkled traveling dress, aware that she must look a fright after her long journey. Preston quickly explained the situation. Pamela's expression changed from surprise to sympathy to outrage. "Those miserable, low-down snakes," she declared, "preying on decent women that way." "Well, you're welcome here, Miss Whittaker. I've got a lovely room just opened up yesterday when Mrs. Henderson moved to her daughter's place." "I'm afraid I have very little money," Elizabeth admitted, the humiliation complete. "Just enough for a night or two." Pamela waved a hand dismissively. "We'll worry about that later. Right now you need a hot meal and a good night's rest. Preston, bring that trunk inside. I'll heat up some stew." Preston carried Elizabeth's trunk upstairs to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. "My sister's cooking will make you feel better," he said as he set the trunk down. "Best food in the territory." Elizabeth managed a smile. "Thank you, Mr. James. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Just happened to be in the right place," he said modestly. "I'll leave you to freshen up. Supper will be ready soon." When Elizabeth came downstairs 20 minutes later, having washed her face and hands and changed into a fresh shirtwaist, she found Preston and Pamela in the dining room. 3 other boarders, 2 older men who Pamela introduced as Mr. Peterson and Mr. Watkins, and a middle-aged schoolteacher named Miss Abernathy joined them at the large oak table. The conversation flowed easily around Elizabeth as she ate the delicious beef stew and biscuits. No one pressed her for details about her situation, though she sensed they were all curious. Preston spoke little, but she felt his eyes on her occasionally, assessing, concerned. After dinner, when the other boarders had retired to their rooms or the parlor, Preston approached Elizabeth as she helped Pamela clear the dishes. "I need to get back to my ranch tonight," he said, "but I'll come by tomorrow. Perhaps I can help you figure out your next steps." "That's not necessary," Elizabeth began, not wanting to impose further. "Let him help," Pamela interjected. "My brother's got connections all over the territory. If anyone can find out who sent those letters or get you situated somewhere, it's Preston." Elizabeth looked at the tall cowboy, his expression sincere, his stance relaxed but somehow protective. Despite her circumstances, she felt a strange flutter in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. James," she said softly. "I would appreciate any assistance you can provide." Preston nodded, settling his hat on his head. "I'll be back mid-morning. Try not to worry, Miss Whittaker. Things have a way of working out in the West." As Elizabeth watched him ride away, the last light of day fading from the sky, she wondered if she dared believe him. Everything she had planned, everything she had hoped for, had vanished like morning mist. Yet somehow, standing in the doorway of this simple boarding house, watching the retreating figure of a man she had just met, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Hope. Elizabeth woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up the stairs. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-fogged mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up with a start. She was stranded in a small frontier town, nearly penniless, with no prospects and no plan. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, and for a moment she considered pulling the quilt over her head and hiding from the day. But her parents had raised her to face difficulties with courage and faith. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," her father had often said. Elizabeth wasn't entirely sure that was scriptural, but the sentiment seemed appropriate now. She rose, washed quickly at the basin, and dressed in one of her simpler dresses, a pale blue cotton with white piping that she had made herself. Her trunk contained finer dresses, including the cream silk she had intended to wear for her wedding, but those seemed inappropriate now. When she descended the stairs, she found Pamela in the kitchen, efficiently managing several pans on the large cast-iron stove. "Good morning, Miss Whittaker," Pamela said cheerfully. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Elizabeth replied, though in truth she had tossed and turned for hours, her mind racing with worries and possibilities. "May I help with breakfast?" "I never turn down an extra pair of hands," Pamela said, handing her a bowl of eggs. "Can you scramble these while I finish the biscuits?" Elizabeth was grateful for the task. In Boston, she had helped with household duties, especially after her mother fell ill. Working beside Pamela in the warm kitchen, she felt a small sense of normalcy return. "I've been thinking about your situation," Pamela said as they worked. "Silver Creek is growing, but it's still a small community. Finding employment won't be easy, especially for a lady with your background." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the unspoken message. There were few respectable jobs for women in a frontier town, particularly one with her Eastern education and limited practical skills. "I can sew quite well," she offered, "and I've taught children. I was a governess for a time in Boston." Pamela brightened. "That might be useful. Our school teacher, Miss Abernathy, you met her last night, has been saying she needs an assistant. The town's growing, and she has too many students for one classroom." "Do you think she would consider me?" Elizabeth asked, hope rising. "It's worth asking," Pamela said, "and in the meantime, you're welcome to stay here. We can work out an arrangement. Perhaps you could help with the boarding house in exchange for your room and board until you get settled." Elizabeth felt tears threatening. "You're very kind, Mrs. Miller. I don't know how to thank you." "Pamela, please," the other woman corrected with a warm smile. "And there's no need for thanks. The West can be harsh, but we look after each other out here. Besides, any friend of Preston's is a friend of mine." "I hardly know your brother," Elizabeth pointed out. Pamela gave her a knowing look. "Preston's a good judge of character. If he brought you here, that's good enough for me." After breakfast was served, and the boarders had departed for their daily activities, Elizabeth helped Pamela with the dishes and laundry. The work was harder than she was accustomed to, but she threw herself into it willingly, grateful for the distraction. She was hanging sheets on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Preston riding toward the boarding house, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking dappled mare. "Good morning, Miss Whittaker," he called, dismounting with that same fluid grace she had noticed the day before. Up close in the bright morning light, she could see him more clearly than she had the previous evening. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines around his eyes and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. His shirt was clean but well worn, his vest leather, his jeans dusty from the ride. "Good morning, Mr. James," she replied, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and the fact that her sleeves were rolled up for work, her hands reddened from the wash water. "I see my sister's put you to work already," he said with a smile. "I'm happy to help," Elizabeth said. "Mrs. Miller Pamela has been very kind." Preston nodded. "That's her way," he gestured to the dappled mare. "I thought you might like to see a bit of the countryside today. It might help you get your bearings." Elizabeth stared at the horse. "You want me to ride?" "I thought we could visit a few places in town, then maybe ride out to my ranch for dinner," Preston said. "Unless you'd rather stay here?" The invitation surprised her. It seemed forward for a man she barely knew to suggest such an outing, yet there was nothing improper in his manner, and Pamela clearly trusted him implicitly. "I should ask your sister if she needs me here," Elizabeth said cautiously. "Already did," Preston replied with a grin. "Came in the back door while you were out here with the laundry. She says you're free to go, and she packed us a lunch." As if on cue, Pamela appeared on the back porch, a cloth-wrapped bundle in her hands and a knowing smile on her face. "Go on, Elizabeth. The sheets can wait. It's a beautiful day for a ride." Elizabeth looked from Pamela to Preston, then at the gentle mare. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "I'd like that, thank you. Let me just change into something more suitable for riding." 15 minutes later. Wearing her darker blue traveling dress, which had a fuller skirt better suited to straddling a horse, Elizabeth returned to find Preston waiting patiently, both horses ready. "I'm afraid I'll have to ride astride again," she said, a touch of color in her cheeks. "I don't have a proper riding habit." "Most women out here ride astride," Preston assured her. "It's more practical for the terrain." He helped her mount the mare, his hands strong and steady on her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Once she was settled, Preston handed her the reins. "This is Daisy. She's gentle as they come and smart too. She'll follow my horse without much guidance, but if you want to control her yourself, just a light touch on the reins is all she needs." Elizabeth tentatively stroked the mare's neck, and the horse nickered softly. "She's lovely." "She's yours for as long as you need her," Preston said, mounting his own horse. "I couldn't possibly accept," Elizabeth began. "She's just gathering dust in my stable," Preston interrupted. "My sister's afraid of horses since a fall she took as a girl, and I've got no one else to ride her. You'd be doing me a favor, taking her out regularly." Elizabeth suspected this wasn't entirely true, but she appreciated the way he'd framed the offer to preserve her dignity. "Thank you, Mr. James." "Preston, please," he said. "Mr. James was my father." They rode slowly down the main street of Silver Creek, Preston pointing out the various businesses and introducing Elizabeth to people they encountered. Everyone greeted Preston warmly, tipping their hats or calling out friendly hellos. It was clear he was well respected in the community. "The town's grown a lot in the last few years," Preston explained. "When I first came here after the war, there was just the general store, the saloon, and a few houses. Now we've got a proper church, a school, even a doctor who comes through once a month." "Were you in the war?" Elizabeth asked, curious about this man who had so unexpectedly become her guide to this new world. Preston nodded, his expression momentarily darkening. 4 years with the Union cavalry, came west afterward like a lot of men, needed open spaces and a fresh start. Something in his tone told Elizabeth not to press further. Instead, she asked about his ranch. "It's modest compared to some," he said, "but it's mine, free and clear. 500 acres, mostly grassland for the cattle. Got a good creek running through it. Enough timber for what I need. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid." "It sounds wonderful," Elizabeth said sincerely. "I've always lived in the city. The idea of so much open space is both frightening and exhilarating." Preston smiled. "That's the West for you, terrifying and beautiful all at once." They stopped at the general store, where Preston introduced her to the proprietor, a jolly man named Samuel Wilson, who insisted on giving Elizabeth a piece of peppermint candy to sweeten her welcome to Silver Creek. Next, they visited the small schoolhouse where Miss Abernathy was teaching a dozen children of various ages. "Preston James, is that you interrupting my arithmetic lesson?" the schoolteacher called, though her tone was more teasing than scolding. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Abernathy," Preston said, removing his hat as they entered. "I wanted to introduce Miss Whittaker properly. She was a governess back east and has experience teaching." Elizabeth shot him a surprised look, wondering how he knew this detail she had only mentioned to Pamela that morning. Miss Abernathy's face lit up. "Is that so? My goodness, what a blessing. I've been praying for assistance with this growing brood." She turned to the children. "Continue with your sums, children. I'll check your work in a moment." She pulled Elizabeth and Preston aside, speaking in a low voice. "The town council just approved funding for an assistant teacher starting next month. The pay isn't much, $30 a month, but it would be a start." Elizabeth felt a surge of hope. "I would be very interested, Miss Abernathy." "Wonderful. Can you come by tomorrow morning? We can discuss the details and you can observe the classroom. If all goes well, you could start next week." The possibility of employment, of having a purpose and a way to support herself, lifted Elizabeth's spirits immeasurably. As they left the schoolhouse, she turned to Preston with shining eyes. "Thank you," she said fervently. "I don't know how you knew about my teaching experience, but I'm grateful you mentioned it." Preston looked slightly embarrassed. "Pamela might have mentioned it when I stopped by this morning. I hope you don't mind." "Mind? You may have just saved me from destitution, Mr. James Preston." His smile warmed her more than the spring sunshine. Let's celebrate with lunch, shall we? I know a nice spot by the creek. They rode a short distance out of town to where a clear stream bubbled over smooth rocks. Cottonwood trees provided dappled shade, and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank. Preston helped Elizabeth dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. He spread a blanket Pamela had packed and set out the simple but hearty lunch-cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apple pie. They ate in comfortable conversation, Preston telling stories of frontier life that made Elizabeth laugh, and Elizabeth sharing tales of Boston that seemed to fascinate him. "Do you miss it?" he asked as they finished the pie. "The East, I mean. The comforts, the culture." Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "Some things, yes. Libraries and bookshops, music, certain foods." She looked around at the wide open landscape, the distant mountains, the endless blue sky. "But there's something about this place, a sense of possibility, as if a person could become whoever they truly are, without the weight of tradition and expectation." Preston nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly it. That's why I stayed, after the war. Back home in Pennsylvania, I was just another farmer's son who'd fought and come back changed. Here, I could build something new." "And you have," Elizabeth said. "Everyone in town speaks highly of you." A faint color touched Preston's cheeks, and he busied himself repacking the lunch basket. "We should head to the ranch if we want to be back before dark," he said, changing the subject. "It's another few miles." The ride to Preston's ranch took them through rolling grassland dotted with spring wildflowers. Cattle grazed in the distance, and a hawk circled lazily overhead. The vastness of the landscape made Elizabeth feel small, yet strangely free. They crested a small rise, and Preston's ranch came into view, a neat log house with a wide porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and corrals. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a dog ran out to greet them, barking excitedly. "Home sweet home," Preston said, a note of pride in his voice. As they rode into the yard, a weather-beaten man in his 60s emerged from the barn. "Thought I heard you coming, boss," he called. "Didn't know you were bringing company." "Hank, this is Miss Elizabeth Whittaker," Preston said as they dismounted. "Miss Whittaker, this is Hank Morgan, my foreman and the best cowhand in the territory." Hank removed his hat, revealing a bald head surrounded by a fringe of gray hair. "Pleasure, madam," he said with a slight bow that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Morgan," Elizabeth replied, charmed by the man's courtly gesture. "Hank's been with me since I bought this place," Preston explained. "Taught me everything I know about ranching." "Had to," Hank grunted. "This city boy didn't know a bull from a steer when he showed up." Preston laughed. "He's not wrong. I'd never even been on a working ranch before I bought this one." "Then how did you know you wanted to be a rancher?" Elizabeth asked, curious. Preston shrugged. "I didn't. I just knew I wanted land, open space, and a chance to build something lasting. The cattle business seemed like a good bet." He turned to Hank. "We'll have dinner at the house. Would you mind seeing to the horses?" "Already got a stew on," Hank said, taking the reins. "Figured you'd be hungry when you got back. Made biscuits, too." "Hank's another reason I've succeeded," Preston told Elizabeth as they walked toward the house. "He's a better cook than most restaurants in Denver." The house was simple but comfortable, with a large main room that served as both parlor and dining room, a kitchen beyond, and what Elizabeth presumed were bedrooms down a short hallway. The furniture was sturdy and practical, with a few unexpected touches of elegance, a set of leather-bound books on a shelf, a good-quality piano in one corner, colorful curtains at the windows. "My sister's handiwork," Preston said, following her gaze to the curtains. "She said the place needed a woman's touch." I didn't argue. Elizabeth moved to the piano. "Do you play?" "Poorly," Preston admitted. "My mother insisted we learn. Pamela was the talented one. I just plink out a tune now and then when I'm feeling homesick for Pennsylvania." "May I?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing to the instrument. "Please." She sat and played a simple melody, her fingers remembering the hours of practice from her childhood. The piano was surprisingly well tuned, and the music filled the room with warmth. Preston stood watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. When she finished, he said quietly, "That's the first time the piano's been played properly since it came west. Thank you." Something in his voice, in the intensity of his gaze, made Elizabeth's cheeks warm. She stood quickly, moving away from the piano. "Your home is lovely," she said, changing the subject. "You've built something wonderful here." "It's a work in progress," Preston replied, "but yes, I'm proud of it." Hank brought in the stew a short while later, and they ate at the large oak table, the conversation flowing easily between the three of them. Hank told stories of the early days of the ranch that had Elizabeth alternately laughing and marveling at the hardships they had overcome. As twilight approached, Preston rose. "We should head back to town before it gets too dark." Elizabeth felt a strange reluctance to leave. There was something about this place, about the man who had created it, that called to her. But propriety demanded she return to the boarding house. "Thank you for a wonderful day," she said as they rode back toward Silver Creek, the sky painted in spectacular shades of orange and purple. "And for everything you've done to help me." "It's been my pleasure," Preston said sincerely. "I hope—" He hesitated, then continued, "I hope you'll consider staying in Silver Creek. The teaching position would be perfect for you, and the town could use someone with your refinement and education." "I have nowhere else to go," Elizabeth pointed out, trying to keep her tone light. Preston's expression grew serious. "That's not what I meant. I hope you'll stay because you want to, not because you have no choice." The simple statement touched Elizabeth deeply. How long had it been since someone had cared what she wanted? Since anyone had seen her as more than a burden or a potential solution to their own problems? "I think I would like to stay," she said softly. "At least for a while." The smile Preston gave her warmed her more than any fire could have on the cooling evening. When they reached the boarding house, Preston helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "I'll be busy at the ranch for the next few days. Spring calving is keeping us all working from dawn to dusk. But perhaps I could call on you Sunday. We could attend church together if you'd like." "I would like that very much," Elizabeth replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Preston held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. "Until Sunday, then. Good night, Elizabeth." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded right in his deep voice, like a promise. "Good night, Preston," she replied, and watched him ride away, wondering at the strange fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or uncertainty. Pamela was waiting inside, her expression far too innocent. "Did you have a nice day?" "Lovely," Elizabeth said, unable to keep from smiling, "and potentially productive. Miss Abernathy has asked me to visit the school tomorrow. There may be a teaching position available." "Wonderful news," Pamela exclaimed. "I knew things would work out. Silver Creek is going to be good for you, Elizabeth Whittaker." Looking at Pamela's knowing smile, Elizabeth had the distinct impression her new friend wasn't just talking about the teaching position. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Elizabeth spent the morning after her ride with Preston observing Miss Abernathy's classroom, then was delighted to be offered the assistant teaching position on the spot. She would start the following Monday, working with the younger children while Miss Abernathy focused on the older students. In the meantime, she helped Pamela at the boarding house, gradually meeting more of Silver Creek's residents as they came and went. Everyone was friendly, if curious about the Eastern lady who had arrived under such unusual circumstances. Word had spread about the mail-order bride scheme, generating both sympathy for Elizabeth and outrage on her behalf. Several of the town's ladies made a point of welcoming her, bringing small gifts, a jar of preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, a handmade doily, and invitations to social gatherings. "They've taken to you," Pamela observed on Saturday evening as Elizabeth arranged the latest gift, a bouquet of wildflowers from Mrs. Wilson, the storekeeper's wife. "That's not always the case with newcomers, especially Eastern ladies." "Everyone has been wonderfully kind," Elizabeth said. "I'm beginning to think being stranded here was the best thing that could have happened to me." Pamela gave her a sidelong glance. "And does my brother have anything to do with that assessment?" Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm. "Preston has been very helpful, of course." Pamela hummed skeptically. "You know, in the 3 years since his ranch became profitable, Every unmarried woman in 50 miles has set her cap for him. He's never given any of them a second glance, yet he's ridden into town every day this week, supposedly for supplies, but somehow always finding time to stop by and see how you're doing. He's simply being kind, Elizabeth protested, though her heart beat faster at Pamela's implication. Preston is kind, Pamela agreed, but he's also discerning. He doesn't waste his time on people who don't interest him. She patted Elizabeth's hand. Just something to consider. Later that night, lying in her small bed at the boarding house, Elizabeth did consider it. Preston James was unlike any man she had known in Boston. There was a directness to him, a lack of pretense that was refreshing after the calculated social interactions of Eastern society. He was confident without being arrogant, strong without being domineering, and kind without expecting anything in return. And he was undeniably handsome, in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of a life lived outdoors and on his own terms. Elizabeth found herself thinking of his blue eyes, the way they crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The careful gentleness of his hands when he helped her mount Daisy, the deep timbre of his voice when he said her name. She turned over, punching her pillow in frustration. What was she thinking? She had come west to marry a man she'd never met, only to be abandoned. Now she was developing feelings for another man she barely knew. It was foolish, impractical, and potentially heartbreaking. Yet when she finally drifted off to sleep, it was Preston's smile that followed her into her dreams. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Elizabeth dressed with particular care in her best day dress, a deep green wool that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She arranged her honey-brown hair in a simple but elegant style, pinning it up at the back of her head with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. "Well, don't you look lovely?" Pamela said when Elizabeth came downstairs. "My brother won't know what hit him." Elizabeth was saved from responding by a knock at the door. Pamela opened it to reveal Preston, looking uncommonly formal in a dark suit, white shirt, and string tie. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his dark hair. In his hand, he held a small nosegay of wildflowers. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his eyes finding Elizabeth and staying there. "Miss Whittaker, you look beautiful." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, accepting the flowers with a smile. "You're very handsome yourself, Mr. James." "These church clothes feel like a costume," he admitted with a self-deprecating grin. "But my mother raised me to respect the Lord's Day." "Mine as well," Elizabeth said, tucking the flowers into her belt. "Shall we go?" Preston offered an arm to each woman, and they walked the short distance to the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street. The church was already filling with families dressed in their Sunday best. Elizabeth noticed curious glances and heard whispers as they entered, but Preston's steady presence beside her gave her confidence. The service was simpler than what Elizabeth was accustomed to in Boston, but the message about God's providence and care felt particularly meaningful given her circumstances. When the congregation sang "Amazing Grace," Preston's deep baritone beside her sent shivers down her spine. After the service, Pastor Andrews, a kindly man with silver hair and warm brown eyes, made a point of welcoming Elizabeth to Silver Creek. "We're delighted to have you join our community, Miss Whittaker," he said. "Especially as our new assistant teacher. The children need good education and moral guidance." "Thank you, Pastor," Elizabeth replied. "I'm looking forward to starting tomorrow." "Miss Whittaker was a governess in Boston," Preston added, a note of pride in his voice that made Elizabeth glance at him in surprise. "She's highly qualified." "Excellent, excellent," the pastor beamed. "God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? What appeared to be a misfortune has turned into a blessing for our little town." As they walked back toward the boarding house, now accompanied by several other church members who were peppering Elizabeth with questions about her background and teaching experience, Preston leaned down to speak quietly in her ear. "I was wondering if you might join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant. It's not fancy by Eastern standards, but the food is good." "I'd be delighted," Elizabeth replied, touched by the formal invitation. "Wonderful. I'll call for you at 5. The afternoon seemed to crawl by as Elizabeth helped Pamela prepare and serve Sunday dinner for the boarders, then changed into her second-best dress, a pale yellow muslin with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. At precisely 5 o'clock, Preston arrived, once again in his suit, his hat in his hands. The hotel restaurant was indeed simple, but clean and pleasant, with white tablecloths and a vase of wildflowers on each table. The other diners, mostly traveling salesmen and a few local couples, looked up with interest as Preston escorted Elizabeth to a table near the window. "Everyone is staring," Elizabeth whispered as they sat down. "Small town," Preston replied with a shrug. "Not much happens here that isn't noted and discussed extensively. By tomorrow, half the town will be convinced we're engaged." Elizabeth laughed, though there was a flutter in her stomach at the thought. That would be quite a scandal, considering we've known each other less than a week. "In the West, courtships can move quickly," Preston said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Life is uncertain out here. People don't waste time once they know what they want." The implication hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly, but both aware of it. Elizabeth was saved from having to respond by the arrival of the waitress, who took their orders with a knowing smile that suggested she, too, had already drawn conclusions about their relationship. Over a dinner of roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie, they talked about Elizabeth's upcoming first day of teaching, Preston's ranch, and their respective childhoods, his on a small farm in Pennsylvania, hers in a comfortable townhouse in Boston. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" Preston asked as they lingered over coffee. Elizabeth shook her head. "Actually, I dreamed of being a writer. I used to fill notebooks with stories when I was a girl." "What kind of stories?" "Adventures, mostly. Brave heroines exploring distant lands or solving mysteries." She smiled, remembering. "My mother worried it wasn't ladylike to have such an active imagination. She thought I should focus on more practical accomplishments, music, needlework, household management." "But you became a governess instead?" "After my parents died, yes. It was one of the few respectable occupations available to a single woman of my background." Elizabeth took a sip of coffee. "What about you? Did you always want to be a rancher?" Preston leaned back in his chair. "No, I thought I'd take over my father's farm someday. But the war changed everything. After 4 years of fighting, I couldn't go back to the quiet life in Pennsylvania. Too many memories, too many ghosts." His gaze turned distant. "I needed open spaces, room to breathe, a place where no one knew me or what I'd done." Elizabeth sensed there was more to the story, pain buried deep, but she didn't press. Instead, she said gently, "It seems you found what you needed here." Preston's focus returned to her, his expression softening. "I did, and now I find myself wanting more than I thought I would again." The intensity in his blue eyes made Elizabeth's breath catch. Before she could respond, the waitress appeared with the bill, breaking the moment. As they walked back to the boarding house in the gathering twilight, Preston offered Elizabeth his arm. She took it, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her, the warmth of his body in the cooling evening air. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "It was lovely." "I enjoyed it," Preston replied. "I don't get to town for social occasions much. The ranch keeps me busy." "It must be lonely sometimes," Elizabeth ventured. Preston glanced down at her. "It can be. Hank's good company, but he's not much for conversation unless it's about cattle or horses." They reached the boarding house all too soon. Preston walked Elizabeth to the door but didn't immediately release her arm. "I was wondering," he said, a hint of uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice, "if you might like to come out to the ranch next Saturday. I could show you more of the property, and Hank's been asking when you'll visit again. He's taken a shine to you." "I'd like that very much," Elizabeth replied, warmth spreading through her at the invitation. "Good." Preston smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I'll pick you up after your school day ends on Friday." He hesitated a moment longer, then lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved knuckles. "Good night, Elizabeth. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Preston," she whispered, her hand tingling where his lips had touched. As she watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the last light of day, Elizabeth acknowledged what she had been trying to deny all week. She was falling in love with Preston James. The realization should have frightened her. She had come west to marry one man and now found herself developing feelings for another, all in the space of a week. It was reckless, impulsive, possibly even foolish. Yet as she closed the door and leaned against it, a smile spreading across her face. Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt truly alive again, filled with hope and possibility. Whatever happened next, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Elizabeth's first week of teaching passed in a blur of activity. The children were curious about their new teacher from the East, some shy, others boldly asking questions about Boston and her journey west. By Friday, she had learned all 23 names of her young charges, established classroom routines, and begun to feel at home in the small schoolhouse. Miss Abernathy proved to be an excellent mentor, offering guidance without being overbearing. "You have a natural gift for teaching," she told Elizabeth as they tidied the classroom on Friday afternoon. "The children adore you already." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, feeling a glow of satisfaction. "I've enjoyed it more than I expected. They're bright and eager to learn." "Most of them, anyway," Miss Abernathy said with a chuckle, nodding toward the desk where Tommy Wilson, the storekeeper's mischievous son, had spent most of the week. "That one will keep you on your toes," Elizabeth smiled, remembering how Tommy had hidden a frog in her desk drawer that morning. She had maintained her composure, gently returning the creature to the outdoors and assigning Tommy extra sums to complete during recess. The boy had looked more impressed than chastened by her calm handling of the prank. "I believe Tommy and I have reached an understanding," she said. "He needs challenge and responsibility more than discipline." Miss Abernathy nodded approvingly. "You'll do well here, Elizabeth. I have a feeling Silver Creek is going to become more than just a temporary stop for you." Before Elizabeth could respond, the schoolhouse door opened, and Preston stood there, hat in hand. Her heart skipped at the sight of him. Tall and solid in his work clothes, a smile warming his face when their eyes met. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, nodding to Miss Abernathy. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Mr. James," the older teacher replied with a knowing smile. "We were just finishing up. I believe you and Miss Whittaker have plans?" "If she's still willing," Preston said, his eyes on Elizabeth. "Of course," Elizabeth replied, gathering her shawl and the small carpet bag she had packed that morning. Pamela had raised an eyebrow when Elizabeth mentioned staying overnight at the ranch, but had simply said, "Preston's sister will be there as chaperone, I assume." When Elizabeth confirmed this, Pamela had nodded. "Then enjoy yourself. My brother's ranch is beautiful in the spring." Now, as Preston helped Elizabeth onto Daisy's back and they rode out of town, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces, Elizabeth felt a sense of freedom and anticipation. The week had been rewarding but tiring, and the prospect of 2 days away from the confines of the small town was exhilarating. "How was your first week of teaching?" Preston asked as they rode side by side, the horses setting an easy pace. Elizabeth told him about the children, Tommy's frog, and how quickly she had come to care for her young students. Preston listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest in her work. "You sound happy," he observed when she paused for breath. "I am," Elizabeth said, realizing the truth of it as she spoke. "A week ago I was devastated to discover I'd been deceived, stranded in a strange place with no prospects. Now I have a job I enjoy, a place to live, and—" She hesitated, then finished softly, "and friends who care about me." Preston's eyes held hers for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "You do." The rest of the ride passed in comfortable conversation about Preston's week at the ranch, the new calves, a fence that needed mending, plans for a cattle drive to Denver later in the summer. As they approached the ranch, Elizabeth noticed activity around the house that hadn't been there during her previous visit. "Are those carriages?" she asked, pointing to several vehicles parked in the yard. Preston nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Yes, Pamela may have mentioned to a few people that you were visiting, and, well, it seems they decided to organize a small gathering to welcome you properly to the community." "A gathering?" Elizabeth repeated, surprised. "Nothing formal," Preston assured her quickly. "Just a few neighbors and friends. Pamela came out early to help prepare. I hope you don't mind. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Elizabeth deeply. Of course not. It's very kind of everyone. As they rode into the yard, Hank emerged from the barn to take their horses, and Pamela appeared on the porch, waving excitedly. "There you are," she called. "Come in, come in. Everyone's waiting to meet Elizabeth properly." Preston helped Elizabeth dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "I'm sorry about this," he murmured close to her ear. "Pamela gets carried away sometimes. We can escape after dinner if it becomes too much." "It's perfect," Elizabeth assured him, touched by his concern. Truly. Inside, the main room had been transformed. Lanterns cast a warm glow, wildflowers adorned every surface, and a dozen or so people stood chatting in small groups. A table along one wall held platters of food-fried chicken, ham, biscuits, several kinds of pie, and a large cake. Everyone. "This is Miss Elizabeth Whittaker," Pamela announced, leading Elizabeth into the room, "our new school teacher and the newest addition to Silver Creek." For the next hour, Elizabeth was introduced to Preston's neighbors and friends ranchers and their wives, the blacksmith and his family, the town doctor who happened to be making his monthly visit, and several others. Everyone was welcoming, asking about her background and how she was settling in without prying into the circumstances that had brought her west. Throughout the evening, Preston remained close by, a steady presence at her side, occasionally resting his hand lightly on the small of her back as he guided her through the room. Each casual touch sent warmth through Elizabeth, making her acutely aware of him even as she conversed with others. After dinner, someone brought out a fiddle, and the furniture was pushed back for dancing. Elizabeth found herself swept into a lively reel, partnered first with the elderly blacksmith who moved with surprising agility, then with several other men in turn. When Preston finally claimed her for a dance, his hand warm around hers, his other hand resting properly at her waist, Elizabeth felt as if everyone else in the room had disappeared. They moved together as if they had danced 100 times before, his tall frame guiding her smoothly through the steps of the waltz. "You dance beautifully," she said, looking up at him. "My mother insisted," Preston replied with a smile. "She said no son of hers would embarrass her at social gatherings by clomping around like a draft horse." Elizabeth laughed. "She sounds like a formidable woman." She was. Preston's expression softened with memory. "Strong, determined, but also gentle and kind. You remind me of her sometimes." The comparison to his mother, clearly meant as a high compliment, warmed Elizabeth's heart. "I would have liked to meet her." "She would have liked you," Preston said with certainty. "Very much." The music ended, and they stood for a moment, still close, reluctant to separate. Then Pamela approached, breaking the spell. "Elizabeth, you must try some of Mrs. Henderson's apple pie. She won't rest until you've told her it's the best you've ever tasted, which it is." She winked at her brother. "You can have her back for the next dance, Preston." The evening continued with more dancing, singing around the piano after Elizabeth was coaxed into playing, and storytelling as the older residents shared tales of the early days of Silver Creek. Gradually, as the night deepened, guests began to leave, thanking Preston and Pamela for their hospitality and warmly including Elizabeth in their farewells, as if she were already part of the family. When the last guest had departed, Pamela showed Elizabeth to a small but comfortable bedroom. "This was meant to be a sewing room," she explained, "but I convinced Preston to put a bed in here for when I visit. I'll be in the room across the hall." "Thank you for arranging the gathering," Elizabeth said. "It was wonderful to meet everyone under such pleasant circumstances." Pamela smiled. "Preston needs more occasions like this. He works too hard and socializes too little." She squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "You're good for him. I haven't seen him smile so much since before the war." After Pamela left, Elizabeth changed into her nightgown and sat by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The vastness of it still took her breath away, so different from the narrow view between Boston's buildings. A soft knock at the door roused her from her contemplation. Opening it a crack, she found Preston standing there, still fully dressed. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice low. "I just wanted to make sure you have everything you need." Everything is perfect, Elizabeth assured him. Thank you for opening your home to me. Preston nodded, his eyes moving over her face as if memorizing her features. Sleep well, Elizabeth. You too, Preston. She closed the door softly and returned to the window, her heart full. Whatever the future held, this night would remain a cherished memory. The music, the laughter, the warmth of community, and most of all, the feeling of dancing in Preston's arms, as if she had found where she belonged. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Elizabeth woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of voices from the kitchen. She dressed quickly in a simple blue skirt and white shirtwaist, pinning her hair in a practical twist suitable for a day at the ranch. When she entered the kitchen, she found Preston and Hank seated at the table, while Pamela bustled around the stove. "Good morning," Pamela called cheerfully. "Did you sleep well?" "Wonderfully," Elizabeth replied truthfully. The bed had been comfortable, but more than that, there had been a peace to the night, with only the sounds of nature outside her window so different from the constant noise of Boston or even the boarding house in town. Preston stood when she entered, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Good morning. Coffee?" "Yes, please." He poured her a cup, adding a splash of cream just as she liked it, a small detail that touched her. They had known each other such a short time, yet he had noticed her preferences. "I thought I'd show Elizabeth the rest of the ranch today," Preston told his sister and Hank as they ate breakfast. "The north pasture is beautiful this time of year with all the wildflowers." "Take a picnic," Pamela suggested. "I'll pack one for you." After breakfast, while Pamela prepared the picnic basket, Preston showed Elizabeth around the ranch buildings, the barn with its stalls for horses and storage for hay, the bunkhouse where the seasonal hands stayed during busier times, the smokehouse, the chicken coop, and the vegetable garden just beginning to sprout with spring plantings. "It's so self-sufficient," Elizabeth remarked, impressed by the orderly functionality of the place. "It has to be," Preston explained. "The nearest town is 5 miles away, and in winter the roads can be impassable for weeks. We have to be prepared to survive on what we have." The concept of such isolation was both frightening and oddly appealing to Elizabeth, who had always lived with neighbors just a few feet away. When they returned to the house, Pamela had the picnic basket ready. "Now don't rush back," she told them with a meaningful look at her brother. "Hank and I have plenty to keep us busy here." Preston helped Elizabeth mount Daisy, then swung up onto his own horse. They rode at a leisurely pace away from the ranch buildings, crossing a small creek and heading toward a rolling meadow that stretched toward distant hills. "This is all your land?" Elizabeth asked, awed by the expanse. "To that ridgeline," Preston confirmed, pointing. "Not as large as some ranches in the territory, but enough for my purposes." They rode for nearly an hour, Preston pointing out features of the landscape and telling stories about his early days on the ranch, mistakes he'd made, lessons he'd learned, the slow process of building something from nothing. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "That first winter, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But when spring came, and I saw the calves being born, the grass growing green again, I knew this was where I belonged." They stopped for their picnic in a meadow filled with wildflowers, bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and yellow coneflowers, creating a natural garden more beautiful than any cultivated plot Elizabeth had seen. Preston spread a blanket under the shade of a solitary cottonwood tree. The picnic Pamela had packed was simple but delicious: cold chicken, biscuits, cheese, and apple tarts. They ate in companionable silence for a while, enjoying the gentle spring breeze and the distant calls of meadowlarks. "Could you be happy in a place like this?" Preston asked suddenly, his voice quiet but intent. "So far from the civilization you're accustomed to?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously, looking out over the rolling landscape. "A week ago, I would have said no. I would have thought such isolation would be unbearable." She turned to him, meeting his gaze directly. "But now, yes, I believe I could be very happy here. There's a peace, a sense of rightness that I've never felt before." Preston's expression softened. "I felt the same way when I first saw this land, as if something inside me recognized it as home." He was sitting close enough that Elizabeth could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the fine lines at their corners from years of squinting in the sun, the slight scar on his chin half hidden by his beard. Without thinking, she reached out to touch the scar gently. "How did you get this?" Preston caught her hand in his, holding it against his face. "Shrapnel. Battle of Cold Harbor." His voice was rough with memory. "I was lucky. Many weren't." Elizabeth saw the shadow of old pain cross his face and understood suddenly why he had sought the peace of this remote place. "I'm glad you survived," she said softly, "and found your way here." "So am I," Preston replied, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Especially now." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then Preston slowly leaned forward, giving her every chance to pull away. Elizabeth didn't move, her heart pounding as his lips met hers in a gentle kiss that nonetheless sent heat coursing through her. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of distress or regret. Finding none, he smiled, a slow, warm smile that made her breath catch. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you standing alone at that train station," he admitted. "That soon?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. Preston nodded. "There was something about you, courage in the face of adversity, dignity despite your circumstances. I admired you immediately." "I was terrified," Elizabeth confessed, "abandoned in a strange place, no prospects, no friends." "Yet here you are," Preston said, "making a new life, winning over the town, teaching their children." He touched her cheek gently. "And making a lonely rancher remember there's more to life than work and duty." Elizabeth leaned into his touch, her heart so full it felt it might overflow. "Preston, The distant sound of galloping hooves interrupted her. Preston was on his feet immediately, his posture alert as he scanned the horizon. A rider appeared, pushing his horse hard across the meadow toward them. "That's Hank," Preston said, frowning. "Something's wrong." They quickly packed up the picnic as Hank approached. The older man reined in his lathered horse, his expression grim. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but there's trouble. Whittaker's men cut our fence in the south pasture and are driving their cattle onto our grazing land." Preston's expression hardened. "How many men?" "4 that I could see, armed." Preston turned to Elizabeth, regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, but I need to handle this. Hank will take you back to the house." "I'm coming with you," Elizabeth said firmly. "It could be dangerous," Preston objected. "All the more reason I should come. Perhaps a woman's presence will help keep tempers from flaring." When Preston still looked doubtful, she added, "I won't get in the way, I promise." After a moment's hesitation, Preston nodded. "Stay behind me at all times." They mounted quickly and rode hard toward the southern boundary of the ranch. As they crested a rise, Elizabeth saw 4 riders herding a small group of cattle through a gap in a barbed wire fence. The men were rough-looking, with bandanas covering the lower half of their faces. Preston pulled his horse to a stop and motioned for Elizabeth and Hank to stay back. Drawing a rifle from his saddle holster, he approached the men slowly. "That's far enough, Whittaker," he called. "You're on James' land." One of the men, clearly the leader, pushed his bandana down and spat on the ground. "This grazing land belongs to whoever can hold it, James. The law don't mean nothing out here." "The law means plenty," Preston replied evenly. "I have deeds filed in Denver for this land. You cut my fence and trespass again, I'll have the territorial marshal on you." The man laughed harshly. "Marshal's 2 days' ride away. A lot can happen in 2 days. All right." Preston's voice remained calm, but Elizabeth could see the tension in his shoulders. "Take your cattle and go, Whittaker. I don't want trouble." "Maybe trouble wants you," Whittaker replied, his hand moving toward his holstered pistol. Elizabeth couldn't stand by any longer. Ignoring Preston's instructions, she urged Daisy forward until she was beside him. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and firm, "surely there's no need for violence. Mr. James has legal claim to this land, as he said." Whittaker's eyes widened at the sight of her, then narrowed calculatingly. "Who's this, James? Your woman?" "Miss Whittaker is a guest," Preston said, his voice tight, "and none of your concern." "Whittaker, huh?" Whittaker's smile was unpleasant. "No relation to me, I hope." Wouldn't want my name associated with a woman who keeps company with the likes of James. Elizabeth lifted her chin. I am proud to be associated with Mr. James, who has shown me nothing but honor and kindness. Unlike some men who resort to trespassing and intimidation. Whittaker scowled, but one of his men laughed. She's got you there, boss. Shut up, Whittaker snapped. He glared at Preston. This ain't over, James. He jerked his chin at his men. Round up the cattle. We're leaving. Preston kept his rifle trained on the men until they had gathered their cattle and ridden back through the cut fence. Only when they were well away did he lower the weapon and turn to Elizabeth, his expression a mixture of relief and exasperation. That was dangerous, he said. Whittaker is not a man to be reasoned with. Yet he left, Elizabeth pointed out. This time, Hank said grimly, he'll be back. Been trying to push into our land for months now. Preston sighed. We'll need to repair the fence right away, and I'll ride into town tomorrow to send a telegram to the marshal. They spent the next few hours helping Hank repair the damaged fence, Elizabeth holding tools and passing them as needed. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the prairie. We should head back, Preston said, wiping sweat from his brow. Pamela will be wondering what happened to us. As they rode back to the ranch house, Elizabeth noticed Preston was unusually quiet. Are you angry with me, she asked finally, for involving myself with Whittaker? Preston looked surprised. Angry? No. Concerned, yes. Whittaker is dangerous, Elizabeth. He's been trying to drive smaller ranchers out of the area for years. He's not above using intimidation or worse. You handled him well, Elizabeth said, with dignity and restraint. Preston's expression softened. There was a time when I might not have. The war, it changed me, made me quick to anger, too familiar with violence. He glanced at her. I've worked hard to find peace again. Elizabeth understood suddenly that he was sharing something deeply personal, a struggle he had faced alone. And have you found peace? Preston was quiet for a moment, then said, more so recently. The simple statement, with its clear implication that her presence in his life had helped bring him that peace, touched Elizabeth deeply. When they reached the ranch house, Pamela was waiting anxiously on the porch. Preston quickly explained what had happened, downplaying the confrontation, but making it clear that precautions would be needed in the coming days. Should we return to town? Pamela asked, glancing at Elizabeth with concern. Preston hesitated, clearly torn between wanting Elizabeth safe and not wanting to alarm her. It might be wise, he said finally, at least until I've contacted the marshal. I'm not afraid, Elizabeth said firmly, but if my presence here complicates things, I'll go back with Pamela. Preston looked at her with such warmth that it made her breath catch. Your presence here doesn't complicate things, Elizabeth. It clarifies them. The ride back to town the next day was quieter than their outward journey had been. Preston was preoccupied, clearly concerned about Whittaker's threats, while Elizabeth was lost in thoughts of their brief, sweet kiss in the meadow and all that had followed. As they approached Silver Creek, Preston finally broke the silence. I'm sorry your visit was interrupted. I had hoped to show you more of the ranch. There will be other opportunities, Elizabeth said, then blushed at her own presumption. Preston smiled, the worry lines easing from his face. Yes, there will be. Many of them, I hope. At the boarding house, he helped her down from Daisy, his hands lingering at her waist. I need to send that telegram to the marshal, but I'll call on you this evening, if I may. I'd like that, Elizabeth replied. True to his word, Preston returned that evening. They sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset and talking quietly. He told her more about Whittaker, a wealthy rancher from Texas who had moved into the area 2 years ago and immediately begun trying to expand his holdings by any means necessary. He's used to getting his way, Preston explained, and he doesn't respect boundaries, legal or moral. Will the marshal help? Elizabeth asked. Eventually, but his jurisdiction covers a large area, and there are more pressing problems than boundary disputes. Then what will you do? Preston sighed. Keep watch, repair fences as needed. Try to avoid direct confrontation. He glanced at her. And make sure you stay safe in town for now." The protective note in his voice warmed her. "I'll be careful," she promised. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth settled fully into life in Silver Creek. Her teaching flourished, with even Tommy Wilson eventually becoming one of her most enthusiastic students after she discovered his talent for mathematics and gave him special problems to solve. She continued to help Pamela at the boarding house in exchange for her room and board, though Miss Abernathy had suggested that with her teacher's salary, Elizabeth might soon be able to rent a small house of her own. "The Jenkins place at the edge of town will be vacant next month," Miss Abernathy mentioned as they walked home from school one day. "It's small but charming, with a nice garden." Elizabeth considered the idea. Independence had always been important to her, yet the thought of living alone, especially with Whittaker's men occasionally seen in town, gave her pause. Preston called on her several times each week, sometimes taking her for rides in the countryside, other times simply sitting with her on the boarding house porch, talking as the evening deepened around them. Each visit deepened her feelings for him, and she could see in his eyes that he felt the same. Yet he had not spoken of marriage, nor repeated the kiss they had shared in the meadow. Elizabeth understood his hesitation. They had known each other just over a month, and the threat from Whittaker remained unresolved. In early June, the town held a social to celebrate the end of the school year. The schoolhouse was decorated with wildflowers and paper chains made by the children, and tables laden with food lined one wall. A small band played, and couples danced in the cleared space in the center of the room. Elizabeth wore her best dress for the occasion, a pale blue silk that she had originally brought west for formal occasions in her new life as Mrs. Blackwell. The irony wasn't lost on her as Preston's eyes widened at the sight of her. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering her his arm. They danced every dance together, oblivious to the knowing smiles and whispers around them. When they stepped outside for a breath of air, the night sky was ablaze with stars. "I never tire of this view," Elizabeth said, gazing upward. "Nor I," Preston replied, though when she glanced at him, she found he was looking not at the stars, but at her. Slowly, giving her every chance to move away, he bent his head and kissed her. Unlike their first kiss, which had been brief and gentle, this one deepened, his arms coming around her, pulling her close as her hands rested on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know it's soon, we've known each other just over a month, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to marry you, if you'll have me." Joy bubbled up inside Elizabeth, bright and unstoppable. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Preston's smile was radiant in the starlight. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this for a week, waiting for the right moment." Inside was a simple but beautiful ring, a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," Preston explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father gave it to her when they became engaged." "It's perfect," Elizabeth whispered, tears of happiness blurring her vision. They returned to the social hand in hand, their news evident in their glowing faces. Pamela was the first to notice the ring, letting out a squeal of delight that drew everyone's attention. "Finally!" she exclaimed, hugging them both. "I was beginning to think my brother would never work up the courage to ask you." The entire town seemed to share in their happiness, with congratulations and well wishes pouring in from all sides. Pastor Andrews beamed at them. "Shall we plan the wedding for later this summer?" he asked. Preston looked at Elizabeth questioningly. "August, perhaps? That would give us time to prepare, and the cattle drive to Denver will be finished by then." "August would be perfect," Elizabeth agreed, feeling as if her heart might burst with happiness. The celebration continued late into the night, but Elizabeth barely noticed the passing hours, too caught up in the joy of being in Preston's arms, knowing that soon they would begin their life together. As he walked her back to the boarding house, Preston said softly, "When I saw you standing alone at that train station, I had no idea my life was about to change forever." Elizabeth smiled up at him. "Nor did I. I thought I had reached the end of my hopes, when in fact, I was just beginning to find everything I truly wanted. Preston kissed her again under the stars, sealing their promise to each other as the warm June night wrapped around them like a blessing. The summer passed in a whirlwind of activity. Elizabeth continued teaching summer sessions for the children who needed extra help, while also preparing for the wedding and her future life at the ranch. Pamela and the other women of Silver Creek rallied around her, helping with wedding plans and offering advice on frontier housekeeping. Preston was busy with the ranch, especially preparing for the cattle drive to Denver, but he made time to ride into town several times each week to see Elizabeth. Together, they discussed plans for their future improvements to the ranch house, the possibility of building a school closer to the outlying ranches so children wouldn't have to travel so far, dreams of the family they hoped to create together. The only shadow on their happiness was Whittaker. His men continued to be seen near Preston's ranch, sometimes cutting fences, other times simply watching from a distance. The territorial marshal had come and gone, warning Whittaker to respect property boundaries, but unable to stay long enough to enforce the warning. "We need to be vigilant," Preston told Elizabeth one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house. "Whittaker isn't the type to give up easily." "Could he truly be dangerous?" Elizabeth asked, concerned by the worry she saw in Preston's eyes. Preston hesitated, clearly not wanting to frighten her but unwilling to lie. "Yes," he said finally. "There have been accidents on other small ranches, mysterious fires, cattle stampeded, water sources fouled, nothing that could be proven, but everyone knows Whittaker was behind them." "Perhaps we should postpone the wedding," Elizabeth suggested, though the thought pained her. "Wait until the situation is resolved." Preston shook his head firmly. "No, I won't let Whittaker dictate our lives. The ranch hands are on alert, and Hank is as vigilant as a mother bear. We'll be cautious, but we'll live our lives as we choose." His determination reassured Elizabeth. Whatever came, they would face it together. In mid-July, Preston left for the cattle drive to Denver, expecting to be gone for 3 weeks. "I hate leaving you," he said as they said goodbye. "But this sale is important for the ranch. The profit will help us make the improvements we've planned." "I'll be perfectly safe in town," Elizabeth assured him. "And I'll have the wedding preparations to keep me busy." Preston kissed her, a lingering kiss that spoke of his reluctance to leave. 3 weeks, he promised. "Then I'll be back, and in just a few more weeks, you'll be my wife." The first week of Preston's absence passed uneventfully. Elizabeth threw herself into teaching and wedding preparations, missing him terribly, but finding joy in the anticipation of their future together. In the second week, rumors began to circulate that Whittaker's men had been seen more frequently around town, watching the boarding house. Preston's friend Sheriff Davis began escorting Elizabeth to and from the schoolhouse, his presence a reassuring deterrent. Then, late one night in the third week of Preston's absence, Elizabeth was awakened by the smell of smoke. She rushed to her window to see flames leaping from the schoolhouse across the street. Throwing on a robe over her nightgown, she ran downstairs to find Pamela and the other boarders already awake, gathering buckets and preparing to join the bucket brigade that was forming. "Stay here," Pamela urged her. "It's not safe." But Elizabeth couldn't remain idle while the schoolhouse, her place of work, filled with books and materials she and the children had created together, burned. She quickly dressed and joined the line of townspeople passing buckets from the well to the burning building. Despite their efforts, by dawn, the schoolhouse was a smoldering ruin. Elizabeth stood among the townspeople, exhausted and smoke-stained, staring at the charred remains in disbelief. Sheriff Davis approached her, his expression grim. "Miss Whittaker, one of the children saw a man running from the schoolhouse just before the fire was discovered. The description matches one of Whittaker's men." "But why?" Elizabeth asked, bewildered. "Why target the school?" The sheriff's gaze was steady. "Because it matters to you, and you matter to Preston James. Whittaker's sending a message." Cold fear washed over Elizabeth. If Whittaker would burn a schoolhouse to intimidate her, what might he do next? And was this just about land? Or had it become something more personal, a vendetta against Preston? The sheriff seemed to read her thoughts. I've sent a rider to catch up with Preston's drive. He should be on his way back from Denver by now. In the meantime, I think you should stay at the boarding house with someone with you at all times." Elizabeth nodded, too stunned and exhausted to argue. As she turned to go back to the boarding house, she saw a rider approaching from the east, a tall figure on a familiar chestnut horse. "Preston!" she cried, running toward him. He dismounted quickly, catching her in his arms. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her face, taking in the smudges of soot and the tears tracking through them. "I'm fine," she assured him, "but the schoolhouse." Preston looked past her at the smoldering ruins, his expression hardening. "Whittaker," he said, not a question but a certainty. Elizabeth nodded. "The sheriff thinks so." Preston's arms tightened around her. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and determined. "I won't have you endangered." "What are you going to do?" Elizabeth asked, alarmed by the steel in his tone. "First, I'm taking you home," Preston said firmly, "to the ranch, where I can keep you safe. Then, I'm going to have a conversation with Whittaker." Despite Elizabeth's protests, Preston insisted on taking her to the ranch immediately. "The boarding house is too accessible," he argued. "The ranch is defensible, and Hank and the hands are there." Reluctantly, Elizabeth agreed. She gathered her belongings while Preston spoke with Sheriff Davis, making arrangements Elizabeth couldn't hear. Within an hour, they were riding out of town, Preston leading the way on his horse, Elizabeth on Daisy, and 2 ranch hands Preston had brought with him flanking them protectively. At the ranch, Hank greeted them with evident relief. "Been worried sick since I heard about the fire," he told Elizabeth. "Glad the boss brought you here where we can keep an eye on you." Preston established a watch rotation among the hands, with someone always patrolling the property. Elizabeth was not to go anywhere alone, even within the ranch buildings. "I feel like a prisoner," she protested that evening as they sat in the main room after dinner. "A protected guest," Preston corrected gently, "just until this situation is resolved." "And how will it be resolved?" Elizabeth asked. "You can't simply shoot Whittaker, no matter how much he deserves it." Preston's smile was grim. "No, but I can confront him directly with witnesses present. Make it clear that his intimidation has been noticed and documented. Sheriff Davis is gathering statements from townspeople about his men's activities, and I've wired the territorial governor about the pattern of harassment. You think that will stop him? It's a start. Men like Whittaker count on fear keeping people silent. When they're exposed, they often back down rather than face legal consequences." Elizabeth wasn't entirely convinced, but she trusted Preston's judgment. If he believed confrontation was the best approach, she would support him. The next morning, Preston prepared to ride to Whittaker's ranch. "I won't be gone long," he promised Elizabeth. "Hank and the men will keep you safe." "Be careful," she urged, fear clutching at her heart. "Whittaker has proven he's willing to do terrible things." Preston kissed her, a fierce, possessive kiss that left her breathless. "Nothing and no one will keep me from returning to you," he vowed. "In 2 weeks you'll be my wife, and all of this will be behind us." Elizabeth watched him ride away, Hank and 2 other hands beside her on the porch. "He'll be all right," Hank assured her. "The boss knows how to handle himself." The hours crawled by. Elizabeth tried to occupy herself with household tasks, helping Pamela, who had insisted on coming to the ranch as well, prepare dinner and sort linens. But her mind remained fixed on Preston, imagining confrontations that grew increasingly dire with each passing hour. It was late afternoon when they heard riders approaching. Hank peered out the window, then relaxed. "It's the boss," he announced, "and Sheriff Davis is with him." Elizabeth rushed onto the porch as Preston and the sheriff dismounted. Preston's expression was grim but satisfied, and he had a cut on his cheekbone that was beginning to bruise. "What happened?" she asked, hurrying to him. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Preston assured her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Whittaker and I had a discussion, with the sheriff as witness." Sheriff Davis nodded. "Whittaker denied everything, of course. But when I presented him with the evidence we've gathered, witnesses who saw his men near the schoolhouse, the pattern of fence cutting, the threats, he became agitated. Threw a punch at Preston here. Which gave me the legal right to defend myself," Preston added with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. You fought him? Elizabeth asked, horrified. Just enough to make my point, Preston said, and to make sure he understood that further harassment would have serious consequences. The sheriff has officially warned him that any more incidents will result in his arrest and prosecution. Will that be enough? Pamela asked skeptically. Sheriff Davis sighed. Hard to say. Whittaker's the type who doesn't back down easily, but he's also not stupid. He knows he's being watched now, and that changes the equation. We'll remain vigilant, Preston said, but I believe the immediate danger has passed. He looked down at Elizabeth, his expression softening. Enough that we can proceed with our wedding plans. Relief washed through Elizabeth. Are you sure? Preston nodded. I won't let fear rule our lives, Elizabeth. We'll take precautions, but we'll also live and love and build our future together, as we planned. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of wedding preparations. The town rallied around them, determined that the threat from Whittaker would not dampen the celebration. When Elizabeth expressed concern about where the ceremony would be held, now that the schoolhouse, which had doubled as a church on Sundays, was gone, Samuel Wilson offered the use of the large open area behind his store. We'll set up benches and decorate it real pretty, he promised. It'll be the finest wedding Silver Creek has ever seen. True to his word, by the wedding day, the space had been transformed. Arches covered with wildflowers marked the entrance and the spot where the ceremony would take place. Benches were arranged in neat rows, and tables laden with food and drink stood ready for the celebration afterward. Elizabeth prepared in a room at the boarding house, helped by Pamela and several other women from the town. Her wedding dress, originally made for a different wedding to a different man, had been slightly altered to better suit her figure and the simpler style of the West. You look beautiful, Pamela said, arranging the simple veil over Elizabeth's honey-brown hair, which she wore down in loose curls as Preston had once mentioned he preferred. A knock at the door revealed Sheriff Davis, who had offered to escort Elizabeth to the ceremony in place of her father. It's time, Miss Whittaker, he said, his eyes widening at the sight of her. You're a vision, if you don't mind my saying so. Elizabeth took his offered arm, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and joy. As they walked toward the decorated area behind the store, she could see the entire town had turned out for the occasion. Even the children from her class were there, scrubbed clean and on their best behavior, their eyes wide with excitement. And there, waiting for her beneath the flower-covered arch, stood Preston. He wore a new suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his beard groomed. But it was the expression in his eyes as he watched her approach that took Elizabeth's breath away, love, pride, and a promise of devotion that needed no words. Pastor Andrews conducted the ceremony with warmth and sincerity. When he pronounced them man and wife, Preston's kiss was both tender and possessive, sealing their commitment to each other as the townspeople applauded and cheered. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and many toasts to the happiness of the newly wedded couple. Even Tommy Wilson behaved impeccably, though Elizabeth caught him sneaking an extra piece of cake when he thought no one was looking. As the evening drew to a close, Preston led Elizabeth to where 2 horses waited his chestnut gelding and Daisy, both groomed to a shine and decorated with flowers. Are we riding to the ranch tonight? Elizabeth asked, surprised. She had assumed they would stay at the hotel in town for their wedding night. Preston nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I have a surprise for you at home. They said their goodbyes, amid more cheers and well wishes, then mounted their horses and rode out of town, followed by Hank and 2 other hands at a discreet distance, a precaution Preston still insisted upon, though there had been no sign of Whittaker or his men since the confrontation. The ride to the ranch was magical, with a full moon lighting their way and the summer night air warm around them. When they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Elizabeth gasped. The house was outlined in the soft glow of lanterns, creating a welcoming beacon in the darkness. As they rode closer, she could see that the porch had been decorated with more wildflowers and ribbons, but the true surprise awaited inside. Preston led her through the main room, which had been thoroughly cleaned and arranged with new curtains and cushions that Pamela must have helped with, to the hallway leading to the bedrooms. He opened the door to what had been his room, and Elizabeth's hands flew to her mouth in astonishment. The space had been transformed. The utilitarian furnishings had been replaced with a beautiful bedroom, set a large four-poster bed with a colorful quilt, matching dresser and armoire, a small writing desk by the window, and bookshelves filled with volumes she recognized from her own collection that she had brought west, along with new ones she had never seen before. "Preston," she breathed, "it's beautiful." "I wanted our home to reflect both of us," he said, watching her face. "Strong enough for the frontier, but with the refinement and beauty you bring to it." He gestured to the books. "I ordered those from Denver. I remembered you said you missed libraries." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "I love it. I love you." Preston's arms came around her, drawing her close. "And I love you, Mrs. James," he murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible." Later, as they lay together in their new bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, Elizabeth felt a peace and contentment she had never known before. The journey that had begun with abandonment and uncertainty had led her to this moment, this man, this life that already felt more real and right than anything she had known before. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That sometimes what seems like the end of all our hopes is really just the beginning of something better than we could have imagined," Elizabeth replied, snuggling closer to him. Preston's arms tightened around her. "In this case, definitely better," he agreed. "Much better." 1 year later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Preston rode in from the north pasture, little William bouncing in the sling across his chest. At 10 months old, their son already loved being on horseback with his father, his blue eyes so like Preston's, wide with excitement at each ride. The past year had brought many changes to the James ranch. The house had been expanded to include a proper nursery adjoining their bedroom. A small schoolhouse had been built halfway between the ranch and town, where Elizabeth taught 3 days a week, bringing William with her. The remaining days, children from the outlying ranches came to her for lessons at the ranch house. Whittaker had eventually sold his ranch and moved back to Texas, unable to withstand the unified resistance of the smaller ranchers who, inspired by Preston's stand, had banded together to protect their lands and livelihoods. Silver Creek continued to grow, with a new, larger schoolhouse rising from the ashes of the old, and plans for a proper church building in the works. Preston had been elected to the town council, his natural leadership and fairness making him a respected voice in community decisions. As Preston dismounted and lifted William from the sling, the baby squealed with delight, reaching his chubby arms toward Elizabeth. "Were you good for Papa?" she asked, taking him and covering his round cheeks with kisses. "A perfect cowboy in training," Preston replied, leaning in to kiss her. "Though he did try to grab the reins a few times." Elizabeth laughed. "Like father, like son, always wanting to be in charge." Preston pulled her close, careful not to squish William between them. "Speaking of sons," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur, "how are you feeling today?" Elizabeth placed a hand on her still flat stomach, where their second child was just beginning to grow. "Wonderful," she said truthfully. "Much better than with William." Preston's face, tanned and lined from sun and weather, but more handsome to her now than ever, softened with love. "I'm glad, though I'll still insist you rest more." "As if that's possible with this little one to chase," Elizabeth replied, bouncing William, who giggled and grabbed at her hair. Preston wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and together they walked into the house, their home, their haven, the center of the life they had built together. Later that evening, after William was asleep in his crib, Preston and Elizabeth sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and promised rain by morning. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Harold Blackwell had been real?" Preston asked, his arm around her shoulders. "If he'd met you at the train that day?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, But then I remembered that such a man, one who would lie to lure a bride west, would never have been the husband I dreamed of. And I would never have met you. Preston's fingers gently tilted her face toward his. I thank God every day for bringing you to that train platform, he said softly, for giving me the chance to help you, to know you, to love you. And I thank God for giving me the courage to trust you, Elizabeth replied, when everything in my experience told me to be wary. Preston's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the vows they had made a year before. When he pulled back, his eyes were serious. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that trust. I know, Elizabeth said simply, resting her head on his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. In the distance, a coyote called, answered by another farther away. The rhythmic creaking of the porch swing, the solid warmth of Preston beside her, the knowledge of their son sleeping peacefully inside, and another child growing beneath her heart, all combined to fill Elizabeth with a profound sense of rightness. She had come west seeking a new beginning, a place to belong, a love to call her own. What she had found in this wild and beautiful land, with this strong and gentle man, was more than she had ever dared to dream. The mail-order bride who had been left at the tracks had found not just a home, but a destiny.